The jar shattered against the barn wall 3 inches from his head. Hayes Yarrow did not flinch. He had been waiting for something to break, had been waiting for it since the moment Willa Ashford found the deed. "Get off my land." Her voice was not raised. That was the worst of it. When Willa Ashford screamed, a man could argue back. When she went quiet like this, cold and absolute, the words pressed into you like a branding iron. "Get off my land, Hayes, and do not come back. Willa, do not." She held up one hand, and the other hand still trembled from the force of throwing the jar, and her dark eyes were full of something that had stopped being grief a minute ago and become something harder. "I trusted you. I let you into this house. I let you near my daughter. Nothing I did was meant to harm you. If you would just let me explain." "Explain what?" "That you went to Garrett Finch behind my back. That you signed your name as a witness on a document meant to strip this farm from me." She pulled the deed from her apron pocket and held it up between them, her hands shaking badly now. "Your handwriting, Hayes. Your signature. Right there next to Garrett Finch's name. Dated 3 weeks ago when you were supposedly helping me redig the irrigation channel." The afternoon sun sat brutal and flat over the Ashford farm. Cicadas screamed in the cottonwood trees. Hayes stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at the woman he loved standing 15 feet away from him like a stranger. "I know what it looks like," he said. "Good. Because it looks like betrayal. It looks like you were using me." Her jaw tightened. "It looks like everything your dark past would suggest you were capable of, and I was fool enough to believe you had changed. Willa, please." "She said she would never forgive him," said old Ruth from the porch, almost to herself, as if reading from a book she already knew the ending of. Hayes looked at Willa Ashford for one long, gutting moment. Her chin was up. Her eyes were brilliant with unshed tears she would not allow to fall. She had built this farm with her own hands after her husband died, had driven off wolves and drought and swindlers with nothing but stubbornness and will. And now she was looking at Hayes Yarrow the way she must have looked at all the rest of them, like something she had survived. He put his hat on. He picked up his bedroll from where it sat against the fence post. And he walked away from the woman he loved in the scorched September light, with the knowledge of what he had done, and what he had been trying to prevent, sitting in his chest like a hot coal he could not dislodge. He had the entire harvest to prove her wrong, if she would let him near enough to try. The summer of 1883 had arrived in the New Mexico territory like a punishment. Drought cracked the flats east of the Pecos River into a mosaic of pale clay, and every rancher and homesteader from Santa Rosa to the Texas border had spent the hot months watching the sky with a desperation that had turned some of them mean and others simply hollow. The Santa Fe Railroad had arrived 2 years prior, bringing with it a new class of businessmen, men like Garrett Finch, who wore Eastern suits and kept lawyers on retainer, and had worked out very quickly that land along the railroad's projected southern spur was worth 10 times what the homesteaders sitting on it believed. Hayes Yarrow had ridden into the territory in February of that year. He had come from up near Cimarron, where he had spent 4 years working cattle drives and 2 more years working something else that he did not discuss. He was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with a scar along his left jaw from a knife fight he had started, and a quietness about him that the territory's old-timers recognized immediately as the particular stillness of a man who had learned to be careful. He had hired himself out to the Ashford farm as a ranch hand in March, the week after Willa Ashford's regular hired man had taken himself down to Las Cruces and not come back. The farm sat on 220 acres of reasonably good land a half-mile west of the Pecos tributary, with a farmhouse, a solid barn, 12 head of cattle, a kitchen garden, and a field that Willa had seeded with winter wheat and planned to rotate with corn in the spring. It was not a grand operation, but it ran because Willa Ashford ran it. Hayes had introduced himself at the gate on a cold March morning and offered to work for room, board, and a modest wage. Willa had looked him over with the careful, unsentimental assessment of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for the world to be kind to her. "You have references," she said. "3. You can write to them. In the meantime, I can fix your fence line, which is a hazard, and your barn roof, which is worse. Why here? There are bigger spreads. I like smaller ones, less complicated." She had studied him for another long moment. "My daughter is 7 years old. My mother-in-law lives with us. You will behave accordingly at all times." "Yes, madam." She had hired him. He had fixed the fence and the barn roof, and then fixed the irrigation channel, and then fixed the rusted-out water pump. And somewhere in the work of fixing things, he had begun to understand that this farm and the woman who kept it alive were the most honest things he had encountered in a very long time. Willa Ashford was 28 years old and had been a widow for 3 years. Her husband Thomas had died of a fever in the spring of 1880, leaving her with a 7-month-old daughter named Clara, and a farm that half the county had privately assumed she would sell within the season. She had not sold it. She had learned to operate every piece of equipment on the property, had hired help when she could afford it, had let go help when she could not, had argued successfully with the county assessor about a valuation error, and had delivered 2 calves herself during a March storm when no one else was available. Hayes had learned all of this gradually, in the way you learned things about people when you worked alongside them every day. Not from Willa herself. She was not a woman who volunteered information about her struggles, but from watching her, and from Ruth, who was Thomas's mother and who sat on the porch most evenings shelling beans or mending and occasionally said things that were more illuminating than she perhaps realized. She carried this place on her back for 3 years, Ruth told Hayes one evening in late April, while they both waited for Willa to come in from the east field. She never complained once. Not even after Thomas died and the bank sent a man out here to ask whether she intended to maintain her position on the mortgage. She told him she intended to maintain her position the same way she always had, which was by working for it, and would he like some coffee while he wrote that down? Hayes had laughed and Ruth had looked at him shrewdly. "She doesn't trust easily," Ruth said. "Not men particularly, not after everything." He had not pressed for details. He had recognized the warning for what it was. What Hayes had not told Willa when he hired on, what he had not told anyone in the territory, was that he had encountered Garrett Finch before. In Cimarron, 2 years earlier, when Hayes had been working for a man named Doyle who ran a small cattle operation that Finch had wanted and had acquired through a method that was technically legal and entirely rotten. Doyle had ended up with nothing. 2 of his hands had ended up in the county jail on manufactured charges. Hayes had ended up with a clear understanding of exactly how Garrett Finch operated and a very personal reason for despising the man. When Finch had arrived in Santa Rosa in January of 1883 and begun buying up land along the projected railroad spur, Hayes had known what was coming. He had ridden south specifically because of it, not because he had planned to work for Willa Ashford or fall in love with her or anything complicated like that. He had planned to watch Finch and, when the moment was right, to do what he had failed to do in Cimarron. The plan had been simple. It had become considerably less simple once Willa Ashford entered it. Garrett Finch was 43 years old, originally from St. Louis, and had the look and manner of a man who had spent his life translating other people's hard work into his own prosperity. He operated out of a suite of rooms at the Santa Rosa Hotel and employed a lawyer named Prescott and a foreman named Cade, who did the kind of work that Finch himself preferred not to have documented. He had bought up 6 properties along the southern corridor since January. 3 had sold willingly. 3 had been persuaded through methods that included a poisoned well, a conveniently timed fire, and a loan called in ahead of its terms. The Ashford farm was next on his list. Hayes had known this since May, when he had ridden into Santa Rosa on a supply run and overheard Cade talking to Prescott at the back of the general store. The 2 men had not recognized Hayes. Why would they? He was just another ranch hand loading flour and nails into a wagon. But Hayes had listened to enough of their conversation to understand that Finch had commissioned a forged land survey, and that Prescott was preparing a legal document claiming a discrepancy in the Ashford property's original boundary that would form the basis of a lawsuit, meant to either acquire the land outright or pressure Willa into selling at a fraction of its value. Hayes had spent 2 weeks trying to determine the best course of action. He could go to the county sheriff, but Sheriff Dalby was a cautious man who was uncomfortable with paperwork and had demonstrated a reluctance to involve himself in anything that required challenging men like Finch. He could write to a lawyer in Santa Fe, but that took time Willa might not have. He could tell Willa directly, but he had not known quite how to explain how he knew what he knew about Finch, or what it would reveal about the reasons he had come to the territory in the first place. He had made the mistake of trying to handle it himself. In June, Finch's man Cade had approached Hayes at the corral one morning when Willa was in the house. Cade was a broad man with small eyes and a professional affability that sat on him like a bad-fitting coat. He had offered Hayes $200 to provide information about Willa Ashford's financial position, her mortgage, her revenue from the wheat field, whether she had money set aside. Hayes had not taken the money, but he had taken the meeting because he had realized that if he maintained a connection to Finch's operation, he might learn enough to stop it before it reached Willa. It was the kind of reasoning that sounded cleaner in a man's head than it looked on paper. In July, Cade had come back with a different proposition. Finch was preparing his legal claim. He needed a local witness, someone who could attest to having observed certain boundary markers in positions that would support Finch's fraudulent survey. If Hayes signed as a witness, Finch would pay him $500 and ensure that when the property transferred, the existing farm hands were kept on under new management. Hayes had refused. He had told Cade to go to hell, but Cade had not gone to hell. Cade had taken the conversation somewhere else entirely. He had told Hayes, quietly and with the particular pleasantness of a man describing the weather, that if Hayes was not willing to cooperate, Finch was prepared to file a separate complaint with the territorial court. A complaint referencing Hayes Yarrow's activities in Cimarron 2 years prior, specifically a night in November of 1881, when Hayes had done something that had not been strictly within the law. Not the most terrible thing a man could do, but enough to see him removed from the territory. Enough to ensure he could not help Willa Ashford or anyone else. Hayes had felt the trap close around him the moment Cade smiled. He had signed the document. He had signed it as witness to a section he had not read, trusting that his name on a fraudulent deed would ultimately matter less than what he planned to do next, which was to ride to Santa Fe and engage a proper attorney who could expose the fraudulent survey and render the deed worthless. He had the name of a man, an attorney named Beckett who had handled a similar case in the Cimarron Valley and who had a reputation for not being intimidated by money. He had planned to be gone and back within 2 weeks before Finch filed anything. He had planned to explain everything to Willa when he returned, with Beckett's letter in hand, in a way that made sense. Willa had found the deed on a Tuesday, filed in Finch's office, which she had visited to attempt a direct conversation about the fraudulent survey. She had heard rumors about it from a neighbor. Prescott had shown her the deed with something that might have been satisfaction, and explained that a witness had been present at the boundary inspection. The witness's name was Hayes Yarrow. She had driven the wagon home in under an hour. She had found Hayes at the barn. The jar had shattered against the wall. Now it was September. The harvest was beginning. And Hayes Yarrow stood at the edge of the road a quarter-mile from the Ashford farm, looking at the long field of corn that had come up astonishingly well despite the drought, because Willa had dug the irrigation channel in June with 3 hired hands and sheer determination. The corn stood tall and ready. The wheat field beside it had been cut and bundled. There was more work in the next 6 weeks than one woman and an elderly mother-in-law and a 7-year-old child could manage. He had nowhere to go that mattered as much as here. He turned back toward the farm. Willa was in the kitchen garden when she heard the gate open. She straightened up with a handful of dry bean pods and turned around, and the expression on her face when she saw Hayes walking up the road went through several things very quickly before it settled on something controlled and cold. "I told you to go. I know you did." He stopped at the garden gate, keeping the fence between them. His hat was in his hands again. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to work the harvest. I don't want your work. Your corn is ready to come in. The drought's been hard on everybody and prices are going to be decent this year if you can get to market before the first frost. You need hands, Willa. I know you're angry with me and you have reason to be, but let me work the harvest. After that, if you still want me gone, I'll go." She stared at him. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the pride warring with the practical reality of 12 acres of corn that needed to come in. "You'll sleep in the barn," she said finally, the words coming out like each one cost her something. "You will not come into the house unless I invite you. You will not speak to me about anything except farm business. And the moment this harvest is finished, you are off this property for good. Agreed? And I want to be clear with you, Hayes Yarrow. What you did, signing that document, was a betrayal. You handed a weapon to the man who is trying to take everything I have worked for in the worst way a person could hand it to him. Whatever your reasons were, whatever story you have prepared, I am not interested in it right now. I need this harvest in. That is all." He looked at her across the garden fence, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said what was sitting underneath all of it, which was that 4 months ago. They had stood in approximately this same spot at dusk, and she had laughed at something he said and leaned slightly against his arm, and he had been so careful not to move toward her because he had not wanted to rush anything, and now the distance between them felt geological. "Understood," he said. He went to the barn and put his bedroll in the corner by the hay. He lay awake that night listening to the cicadas and the particular silence of the house where Willa and Ruth and Clara were sleeping. And he thought about the letter he had already sent to Beckett in Santa Fe, which had gone 2 weeks ago, and which he had not yet received a reply to. He needed Beckett to answer. He needed him to answer soon. In the morning he rose before dawn and had the horse fed and the milking done before the house showed any light. When Willa came out at first light, she found the yard swept, the water buckets filled, and Hayes already at the far end of the cornfield, working a row with practiced efficiency. She stood looking at him for a moment with an expression Ruth later described as complicated. Then she went in to start breakfast and said nothing about it. Clara was not old enough to understand fully what had happened, but she understood that Hayes was not eating at the table anymore, and that her mother's face had a new set to it. That meant the subject was closed. Clara was a serious child with her mother's dark eyes and her father's sandy hair, and she observed the situation with the focused attention of a 7-year-old who had worked out that adults frequently concealed important information. On the second day of the harvest, she brought Hayes his lunch at the far end of the cornfield, which was a task Willa had assigned her as an efficiency measure rather than a gesture of warmth. "Mama is still angry," Clara reported, setting down the tin pail with the care of someone delivering important intelligence. "I know," Hayes said. "Are you going to fix it?" He looked at the child. She was looking at him with a directness that was entirely her mother's. "I'm going to try," he said. "What did you do?" "Something that looked much worse than it was. But I should have told your mother about it instead of handling it on my own. That was my mistake." Clara considered this. "Ruth says men are always solving the wrong problem." Hayes pressed his mouth together. "Ruth might be right. Ruth usually is." Clara picked up the empty pail and turned to go, then stopped. She cried, "Mama," once. She thought I was asleep, but I could hear her. She doesn't cry very much. Hayes looked at the corn row in front of him. The words hit somewhere that was not quite his chest and not quite his stomach. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." Clara walked back across the field. Hayes watched her go and then turned back to the corn, and he worked through the afternoon without stopping, because work was the only available thing. By the end of the first week, they had brought in a third of the corn. Hayes had recruited a neighboring farmer named Aldous Webb, who owed Willa a favor from the spring when she had lent him seed at a critical moment, and Aldous had brought his 2 teenage sons and worked 2 days without pay. The corn came in fast, the ears fat and pale yellow in the September light, piled into the wagon and taken to the barn for drying and eventual transport to the grain merchant in Santa Rosa. Hayes worked from before dawn until after dark every day. He did not try to speak to Willa about anything except the work. He was careful, deliberate, respectful of the terms she had set. When their hands accidentally touched passing a tool across the fence rail on the 8th day, he stepped back immediately and she looked away, and neither of them mentioned it. But things were observed. Ruth was always on the porch. On the 9th day, Ruth brought Hayes a piece of apple pie and sat down in the chair beside the hay bale where he was eating his dinner alone outside the barn. "You know what the problem is," Ruth said. "It was not a question. I expect you're about to tell me. She doesn't know why you did it." "She thinks she does. She thinks you were bought by Finch or that you have some arrangement with him. But that's not it, is it?" "No." "Then you need to tell her." She said she didn't want to hear it. Ruth gave him a look that was somewhere between exasperated and sympathetic. "Hayes, I have been watching men and women navigate their difficulties for 57 years, and let me tell you something. When a woman says she doesn't want to hear your reasons, what she most often means is that she's afraid your reasons are good ones, and she's not ready to let go of being angry yet because the anger is holding something else up. You understand?" He looked at the old woman. "The anger is holding something else up." He had understood that, actually. He had understood it since the moment Willa had thrown the jar, because she had thrown it 3 inches from his head, which a woman of her accuracy, and Willa Ashford was accurate in everything, would only do if she had aimed to miss. "I sent a letter to an attorney in Santa Fe," he said. "A man named Beckett who has handled cases like this before. I've been waiting for his reply. I thought if I could bring her something concrete, something that showed her what I had actually been doing and what I intended to do, it would be easier for her to hear." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's sensible. But in the meantime, she's sleeping 3 hours a night and working herself to exhaustion and telling herself she was a fool to trust you, and that particular story is getting more established every day you don't challenge it." He finished his pie. "I'll think on it." "Think quickly," Ruth said, and took the plate and went inside. The letter from Beckett arrived on the 11th day, brought by the male rider who came out to the rural properties twice weekly. Hayes was in the field when it arrived. It was Ruth who took it from the rider and brought it out to him, and stood beside him while he read it. Beckett had written 4 pages in a small, precise hand. He had received Hayes's letter and had conducted initial inquiries. The fraudulent survey was exactly as Hayes had described. Beckett had been able to identify the surveyor Finch had commissioned, a man named Pryor, who had a history of producing convenient survey results, and who had in fact already been censured by the Territorial Surveyor's Office once. More importantly, Beckett had found a prior case in the territory in which Finch had used the identical method. The fraudulent survey, the forged deed, the witness signature, to acquire a property near Albuquerque, and in that case the original owners had successfully challenged the deed by demonstrating the survey's fraudulence. The challenge had been filed in federal territorial court, which was beyond Sheriff Dalby's uncomfortable jurisdiction, and had been decided in the landowner's favor. Beckett was prepared to take the Ashford case. He required a retainer of $40, which Hayes did not have. He required a signed statement from Willa Ashford authorizing him to act on her behalf. He required copies of Willa's original land grant and mortgage documentation. And he required Hayes to provide a sworn affidavit detailing his interactions with Cade and the circumstances under which he had signed the deed. That last part was the part Hayes had known was coming. The affidavit would require him to explain not just what Cade had threatened him with, but what exactly Cade had threatened him with, which meant explaining what had happened in Cimarron in November of 1881. He stood in the cornfield with Beckett's letter and thought about the cost of telling Willa everything. He went to find her. She was at the far end of the wheat field, checking the remaining stubble and making notes in the small book she carried for farm accounting. She heard him coming and did not turn around immediately, which was its own kind of message. "I need to speak with you," he said. "Not about the harvest, about Finch, and about what I did, and about what I should have told you from the beginning. I have a letter from an attorney in Santa Fe who can stop Finch from taking your land. But he needs your authorization, and before I ask for that, I owe you an explanation." She turned around. Her expression was guarded, and it cost her something to keep it that way, he could see. "Go ahead." He told her everything. He started with Cimarron, because Cimarron was the beginning of everything relevant. He told her about Doyle's operation and what Finch had done to it. He told her about the night in November of 1881, which had involved a confrontation with 2 of Finch's men that had gone further than Hayes had intended, had ended with one of Finch's men unconscious and a considerable amount of other men's property destroyed, and had resulted in Hayes leaving Cimarron quickly and quietly before anyone could file a report. He had not killed anyone. He had not stolen anything. But what he had done was not legal, and Finch knew it, and that knowledge was a collar Finch had been holding the end of. He told her about coming to the territory specifically because of Finch, about his original plan to gather evidence and take it to proper authorities, about how that plan had evolved as he came to know the farm and the situation better. He told her about Cade approaching him at the corral in June, about refusing the money, about the second approach in July and the trap that had closed around him. "I signed it because I believed I could make it irrelevant before he filed it," he said. "I had already written to Beckett. I thought I would be back from Santa Fe with a lawyer's letter before any of this reached you." He paused. "I know that sounds like a man justifying himself." "It does," she said. "Go on." "What I should have done was tell you the first time Cade came to the corral." The first time I knew Finch had you in his sights. You deserved to know that from the beginning, and I kept it from you because I thought I could handle it, and because I didn't want to explain my history in Cimarron." He looked at her steadily. "That was wrong. I was protecting myself and telling myself I was protecting you. Those are two different things." Willa was quiet for a long time. A hawk was turning slow circles above the wheat stubble. The afternoon light was beginning to amber at the edges. "What happened in November of 1881, she said carefully. "The thing you're afraid to have in a document. Two of Finch's men came to Doyle's property after hours. I don't know what they intended. There was talk about another fire, the kind that solves property disputes in a permanent way. I stopped them. It involved a considerable amount of force and the destruction of Finch's wagon and supplies. One of his men was hurt badly enough to need a doctor, though I was told later that he recovered. I left before the sheriff arrived because I knew how that conversation would go." She considered. "You stopped a fire." "I stopped two men who were likely there to start one. I don't know for certain what they intended. I know what I believed at the time, and Finch has used that against you." "Yes." She folded her arms and looked at the field and was quiet again. The hawk landed at the far end of the stubble and began walking deliberately through the cut stalks. "What does the attorney need from me?" she said finally. Something shifted in Hayes's chest. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of the possibility of it. A signed authorization. "And your original land grant documents? I have them. They're in the strong box." She turned to look at him, and her expression had changed. The cold control was still there, but the quality of it had changed, become something less like armor and more like consideration. "Hayes, I am not finished being angry with you. I know. You kept things from me that were directly my concern. You made decisions about my life without consulting me. The fact that your reasons were better than I thought does not change the fact that you thought it was your place to decide what I should know. You're right. And yet," she stopped. "Yet," he said carefully. "And yet, you are the first person who has come to this farm in 3 years with the intention of actually preventing something instead of taking advantage of it." She pressed her lips together. "I need to think. Bring me the attorney's letter tonight after supper." He brought her the letter. She read all 4 pages at the kitchen table, while Ruth and Clara sat nearby pretending to do other things. When she finished, she read it again. Then she set it down and got up and went to the bedroom and came back with a tin strongbox, from which she removed a bundle of papers tied with a cord. "These are the originals," she said. "The land grant is on top. I'll write to Beckett tomorrow and send these as copies. He'll need the originals eventually, but copies will begin the process." "The $40, she said. "I have it." He had had exactly $42 left in the world, which he had been keeping in his boot because the barn had no strongbox. She looked at him. He could see her calculating the weight of that. A man who had spent his last $40 beginning a legal proceeding on behalf of a woman who had thrown a jar at his head and told him to leave. "I will pay you back," she said. "You don't have to. I will pay you back." Her voice was firm on it. She would not take charity. He understood that and did not argue. She handed him the papers and went to bed, and Hayes sat by the lamp for an hour copying the land grant in his careful hand, and it was the most peaceful hour he had spent in 11 days. The harvest continued. There was a rhythm to it that Hayes found he needed like breathing. The corn came in row by row, the field shrinking daily, the barn filling with the dry, sweet smell of drying corn and hay, and the particular autumnal dust of late harvest work. The mornings were cold now, the first edge of October coming on, and the nights had teeth in them that Hayes felt keenly in the barn. He began leaving small things at the kitchen door in the early mornings. Not grand gestures. He had learned enough about Willa Ashford to know that grand gestures would irritate her. But the firewood box was always full before she came down. The water in the kitchen pump was always primed. Once, when he had gone to Santa Rosa for supplies and passed the general store, he had seen a particular kind of apple that Clara had mentioned she liked, and he had brought back 6 of them and left them in a small basket by the door. Clara had told him, solemnly, that they had been very good apples. Ruth observed these small proceedings from the porch with an expression of cautious approval. Willa noticed all of it. She said nothing about any of it, but she was aware of all of it, and Hayes could tell because she was a woman who missed nothing and who reacted to things in the set of her jaw and the angle of her shoulders rather than in her face, and both of those things had changed infinitesimally from the cold precision of that first week. On the 14th day, she brought him coffee in the field herself. She did not sit down. She handed him the cup and stood a few feet away while he drank it, looking at the progress of the harvest. "You've gotten more than half of it in already," she said. "Aldous is coming back Friday with his boys." "I know. He told me." She paused. "The corn looks well, better than I expected, given the drought. You dug the channel at the right time. Another 2 weeks and the soil would have dried past the point of recovery." She looked at the cornfield for a moment, and something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity. "Thomas always said this land was stubborn, said it didn't want to yield easily but it rewarded persistence." She stopped, as if she had said more than she intended. "He was right," Hayes said carefully. She took the empty cup back. Their fingers touched around the tin, and this time neither of them stepped back immediately. She looked at his hand and then at his face, and he looked back at her, and the moment was brief and not brief at all, the way certain moments are. She went back to the house. Hayes turned to the cornfield and stood there for a moment with his hand still warm from the cup before he went back to work. The reply from Beckett came on the 16th day, and it was transformative. Beckett had filed in federal territorial court. He had submitted Hayes's affidavit, which Hayes had written and sent, along with the Ashford land documents and a preliminary challenge to the survey. More importantly, Beckett had found the surveyor prior and had convinced him, through a combination of legal pressure and an offer of leniency in the territorial surveyor's office censure, to provide a signed statement admitting that the survey had been commissioned by Finch and conducted in deliberate violation of the original boundary markers. Finch's legal position had, according to Beckett, collapsed considerably in the last 48 hours. Prescott had contacted Beckett to discuss the possibility of a settlement, which in Beckett's professional opinion meant that Finch was looking for a graceful exit. Beckett recommended that Willa accept no settlement that required any modification of the original boundary, and anticipated that a complete withdrawal of Finch's claim was the probable outcome within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Willa read this letter at the kitchen table, and this time Ruth was not pretending to do other things. She was watching directly and openly, which was Ruth's prerogative and which nobody questioned. When Willa finished reading, she set the letter down very carefully on the table. She put both hands flat on the wood surface. She breathed in once slowly. "He's going to fail," she said. "Yes," Hayes said. "Finch is actually going to fail." "Yes, madam." Ruth made a soft sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. Clara, who had been listening from the hallway, came into the kitchen and climbed into her grandmother's lap without being asked. Willa stood up and crossed the kitchen and stood at the window looking out at the farm, her farm, the field and the barn and the cottonwoods along the fence line. And Hayes could see the line of her shoulders from where he stood, the way they slowly released something they had been holding for a very long time. "Hayes," she said without turning around, Yes, thank you. It was 2 words. In the context of Willa Ashford's particular economy of expression, they arrived with the weight of something much larger. "You're welcome," he said. She turned around, and she was not crying. She was Willa Ashford, and she did not cry where anyone could see, but her eyes were bright, and there was something open in her face that had not been there since before he left. "Supper," Ruth announced. "Hayes, sit down." He sat down at the table for the first time in 16 days. Clara immediately sat next to him and began telling him about the school lesson she had done that morning. And Ruth set a plate in front of him that had more food on it than he had eaten in a week. And across the table, Willa looked at him for a moment with an expression he did not try to interpret, because some things needed to be approached slowly. But he was inside the house again. That was something. The next week had a different quality to it. Not easy, nothing with Willa was easy, which was part of what he had come to love about her, but the ice that had formed between them was no longer solid. It had begun to develop the particular integrity of ice in late winter, firm in some places and unreliable in others. They worked the harvest together more closely now, the practical requirements of the final push requiring coordination that eroded the careful distances. He held the wagon while she checked the corn's moisture levels. She held the horse while he reset a wheel spoke that had cracked under the weight of full loads. Small physical cooperations that were not nothing. In the evenings, sitting on the porch, Hayes on the step, Willa in her chair, Ruth and her mending, Clara asleep inside, they talked. Carefully at first about farm things, then about other things. She told him about Thomas, whom she had loved and who had been a good man and a decent farmer, and whom she missed in the practical way of someone who had shared 10 years of working life with a person. Though she was honest enough to say that the grief had softened and become more like a fondness for a chapter that had closed. He told her about Cimarron, more than he had told her in the field. Not just the night in November, but the years before it, the cattle drives, the particular education of working the land with different people in different places, what he had learned and what he had not learned, what he wanted. "What do you want?" she said one evening, and the directness of it made him look at her. "This," he said, and then, carefully, "I mean the work. The kind of work where what you do means something the next day." She looked at him with the look that saw further than most people's looks went. "And nothing else." The porch boards creaked. A coyote called from somewhere across the flat. Hayes looked at his hands. "I think you know the answer to that," he said. "And I think you know that I'm not going to say it before you're ready to hear it." She was quiet for a while. Ruth's needle moved steadily through the cloth. "I was very angry with you," Willa said at last. "I know. I think I told myself I was angry about the deed and about Finch, and those things were real, but some of it was I had trusted you. I don't trust easily, and I had trusted you, and so the fear of having been wrong about you was mixed up in all of it." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the dark field. "You weren't wrong about me," he said. "No," she said slowly. "I know that now. But knowing it and feeling it are different things, and I'm still finding my way between them." He nodded. "I'll be here," he said simply. She looked at him then, and something moved across her face, not the complicated armored look of the past weeks, but something softer and more genuine, something that looked like the beginning of a decision. "Good," she said. "Now go to sleep. We have the last quarter of the cornfield tomorrow, and I want to start at first light." He stood and stepped off the porch and said good night, and she said good night. And the thing that was happening between them continued to happen in the careful, unhurried way that things happen when the people involved have both been hurt before, and are not inclined to rush toward anything. The letter from Beckett arrived on the 23rd day of the harvest. It was a short letter this time, 4 sentences. Finch had withdrawn his claim entirely. Prescott had filed the withdrawal in federal territorial court. A copy would be forwarded to the county assessor's office. The Ashford land was legally, completely, unambiguously Willa Ashford's. Willa read the letter standing in the yard with the wagon still loaded behind her from the morning's work. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket, and turned to look at the farm around her. The house, the barn, the field with its remaining rows of corn, the fences she had repaired and the channel she had dug, and the cottonwoods she had planted the year after Thomas died, because she had decided she was staying, and she had wanted shade. "It's over," she said. Hayes stood a few feet away. "It's over." She pressed her lips together, and her chin did a thing it did sometimes when she was managing something large, a small tightening that meant there was more under the surface than the surface showed. And then she crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and put her arms around him. And he stood very still for one surprised moment before he put his arms around her. And she held on with the grip of a woman who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and had just been given permission to set it down. She did not cry. She was Willa Ashford, and she did not cry in yards, but she held on for a long moment, and he held her back, and when she stepped away her eyes were very bright and she looked at him with something new and clear. "I'm still working on forgiving you," she said, "but I'm closer." "Take whatever time you need," he said. She searched his face. "Do you mean that? You'll wait?" "I'll be here every morning at first light," he said. "However long it takes." She nodded once, something settling behind her eyes. Then she turned back to the wagon. "Help me get the rest of this corn unloaded. We're almost done." The last week of the harvest had a sweetness to it that Hayes felt in his bones. The corn came in, the final wagon load stacked in the drying barn, and then there were the remaining tasks. The secondary wheat field to check, the root vegetables to bring in before the first hard frost, the cattle to rotate to the winter pasture. All of it work he had done before, and all of it work that felt different because of who he was doing it alongside. Willa began leaving his coffee on the fence post in the mornings, so it was there when he came out of the barn. It was such a small thing. It was one of the largest things anyone had done for him in a very long time. One evening in the 4th week, she came to the barn after supper with a lantern, which was not something she did, and Hayes put down the harness he was mending and stood up. "I want to tell you something," she said. She set the lantern on a hay bale and stood with her hands folded in front of her, which was her posture when she had thought something through and arrived at a conclusion. "I've been thinking about what you said about handling things yourself, deciding what I should know. And I've been thinking about the fact that I do the same thing." He waited. "I have been managing this farm alone for 3 years, and I have been very good at it, and I have been very protective of my ability to do it alone, because I had to be. And somewhere in that, I think I was also protecting myself from needing anyone, from trusting anyone." She looked at him steadily. "So when you kept things from me, part of what made it hurt so much was that it confirmed a story I was telling myself about why trusting anyone was dangerous." "Willa," he started. "Let me finish." She took a breath. "You were not trying to hurt me. You were trying to protect something you cared about without knowing how to ask for help doing it, and I understand that impulse perhaps better than I should." The corner of her mouth moved. "We are, it seems, similarly foolish in that respect." He looked at her across the lantern light. She was beautiful and serious and the most real person he had been in a room with in years. "What are you telling me?" he said softly. "I'm telling you that I forgive you," she said. "Fully. Not mostly, not with conditions. I forgive you, Hayes." The words settled in the lantern-lit barn with the smell of hay and horses and the particular quiet of a night in late October when the harvest is in, and the land has given everything it has and is resting. "I don't deserve that yet," he said. "That's not how forgiveness works," she said, and there was the ghost of something warm in her voice. "You don't earn it, I give it, because keeping it from you was hurting me and I have had enough of being hurt." She looked at him steadily. "But I will tell you this. If you ever again decide something is my concern and choose to handle it without telling me, you'll throw something," he said. "I'll throw something considerably heavier than a jar," she said. And that was the first real thing that had passed between them in 4 weeks. The first moment of actual warmth that did not have anything careful wrapped around it. And Hayes laughed, a genuine and relieved and slightly undone laugh. And Willa's face opened into a smile that he had not seen since before everything had gone wrong. The real smile that changed her whole face. He crossed the barn toward her in 2 steps and stopped close enough that the lantern light was between them and looked at her. "May I?" he said. She looked at him for just a moment. Then she said, "Yes," and he took her face carefully in his hands and kissed her, gently and then less gently, and she kissed him back with the complete commitment she brought to everything she decided to do. When they stepped apart, she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, open and warm and a little unguarded, which for Willa Ashford was the equivalent of another person entirely coming undone. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been in love with you since approximately June." "I think," he said, "that I have been in love with you since you argued with the county assessor and won." She laughed, and it was the laugh he had been waiting 4 weeks to hear again. "That was in May." "Yes," he said, "it was." She picked up the lantern. "Come inside for breakfast tomorrow, properly." "Yes, madam." She went to the barn door and then stopped. "Hayes, the $40 I will be paying you back." "Willa." "I will be paying you back," she said firmly, and there was the smile again, the real one, before she turned and walked back across the dark yard to the house. He stood in the barn for a minute listening to the night sounds of the farm, the horse shifting in its stall, the wind in the cottonwoods, a dog barking somewhere across the flat. And he felt something he had not felt in Cimarron or on any of the cattle drives, or in any of the years of moving from place to place, which was the solid and specific sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. The following weeks moved with a new energy. November came in cold and clean, and Hayes moved his bedroll from the barn to the small room that had been Thomas's office, which Ruth cleared out and refitted with a proper cot, and a washstand with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been waiting to do exactly this and was not going to make ceremony of it. "I didn't want to presume," Hayes said. "You have been sleeping in a barn for 2 months, Ruth said. "I am presiding over the end of that." Clara, informed of this development, was satisfied. She had been of the opinion that the situation was inconvenient and should be resolved. Hayes and Willa moved slowly, with deliberation and care, which suited both of them. They were not young people in a rush, and they were both people who had reasons to be careful with what they decided to trust. But they moved nonetheless, and every day the trust built on itself, small proven promises accumulating into something solid. He proved reliable. He proved honest in the daily ways that matter more than grand declarations, keeping his word about small things, asking before deciding, telling her things he could have managed to not tell her because they reflected badly on him. She noticed all of this, because she noticed everything, and she responded in kind, opening slowly like a field after winter, the frozen surface giving way by degrees to the warmer thing underneath. In December, Hayes rode to Santa Rosa and had a long conversation with Beckett, who had come down from Santa Fe to finalize the court filing and required a few additional signatures. While he was in Santa Rosa, he made 2 other stops, one to the land office and one to the bank. He came back in the late afternoon, with the wagon loaded with winter supplies, and an expression that Willa identified immediately as the expression of a man carrying something he was not sure how to say. After supper, after Clara was in bed and Ruth had gone to her room, they sat by the fire in the way they had taken to doing in the evenings, Willa with her accounting book, Hayes with whatever needed mending, and the fire between them and the wind outside. "I want to ask you something," Hayes said. She set down the accounting book and looked at him. "I went to the land office today. I registered a homestead claim on the 80 acres north of your property, the Tilden parcel that's been sitting idle for 2 years. The claim is mine, but the acreage would effectively extend your watershed access and give you a buffer against anyone else trying to acquire land adjacent to yours." He paused. "I did this without consulting you, which I am aware is exactly the thing you asked me not to do." She looked at him for a moment. "Go on. I thought of that. And I decided that I wanted to tell you what I was planning before I did it, and then I thought about how to tell you, and I realized that what I actually wanted to ask was whether you would consider making that parcel not mine alone but ours." Silence. The fire shifted. "Are you asking me to marry you," Willa said, "or are you asking me to co-register a land claim?" "Both," he said. "The land claim because it makes practical sense, and because I want this farm to be secure in every direction. And the marriage because I love you and I want to spend my life here if you'll have me." She was quiet for a longer moment than he would have liked. He held very still. "You went to the bank as well," she said. He had not told her that. "Yes. What for?" He reached into his coat pocket and set a bank receipt on the table between them. "I had some money put aside. I've been putting it aside for a year. It's not a great deal, but it covers the remaining year of your mortgage, which I would like to give you not as a gift but as a contribution to a partnership, if you agree to one." Willa looked at the receipt. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him, and her expression was doing several things at once in the way that was particular to her. "You thought all of this through," she said. "I thought about it for a long time. And you're telling me all of it right now, before doing anything beyond filing the land claim." "Yes." She stood up and came around the table and sat down in the chair beside his and took his hand, which she had not done before, taken his hand, deliberately and first. Her hand was calloused and strong, a working hand, and it held his firmly. "Yes to the marriage," she said. "And yes to the partnership, and yes to all of it." She looked at him with her clear, direct gaze. "But I want to be clear about something. This farm is mine and I will continue to manage it. You will work beside me, not above me, and every large decision will be made together." "That's the only way I want it," he said. "Good." She squeezed his hand once. "Then yes." He looked at her, this woman who had thrown a jar at his head and told him to go, and then allowed him to earn his way back with nothing but work and honesty, who had built something real from grief and drought and solitude, who had managed to love him in spite of excellent reasons not to. "You are the most remarkable person I've ever known," he said. She allowed this with a slight tilt of her chin that might have been acknowledgement or might have been not quite believing it. "Don't let it go to your head," she said, but her eyes were warm. Willa wore a dress of deep blue wool that Ruth had altered from something in a trunk, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers Clara had prepared with absolute seriousness, and she looked at Hayes during the ceremony with the look that was hers alone, clear and warm and completely decided. Clara stood at Willa's side and was very grave and very beautiful. And when the minister said the final words, she leaned slightly against Hayes's arm in a gesture so similar to something her mother had done 7 months ago that Hayes had to press his mouth together to keep his expression steady. After the ceremony, they ate at the hotel dining room, which was the largest space available, and Aldous Webb produced a fiddle and played for 2 hours while the night outside grew cold and the room warm with lamplight and company. Hayes danced with Willa 3 times, which was 3 more times than he had danced in years, and she danced with him with the same committed efficiency she brought to everything. And on the third dance, she laughed at something he said against her ear and stayed close afterward, which was all he wanted. That winter was cold but manageable. Hayes proved himself a good partner in the practical ways that mattered for farm winters. He was methodical about supplies, careful with the cattle in the cold snaps, handy with repairs that froze up wood and metal required. Clara decided by February that Hayes was her father and conducted herself accordingly, which Hayes accepted with a quiet seriousness that Clara recognized as the appropriate response, and which made Ruth cry once, privately, in her room. In the spring, Hayes broke the Tilden parcel and they planted it in oats, which were drought-resistant and commanded a decent price, and diversified the farm's income in a way that Willa's accounting book approved of. The work of a new field was hard and shared, and by the time the oats went in they had developed the particular rhythm of 2 people who work well together, who know each other's habits and strengths, who argue sometimes and concisely and resolve it and move on. The farm expanded. Gradually, carefully, in the way of people who have learned not to overreach. In the spring of 1885, Willa told Hayes she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, matter-of-factly, the way she told him most things that mattered, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her, and she watched his face with the particular focus of a woman waiting to see what a man does with large news. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then her mouth, and she put her hands against his chest, and for a moment they just stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming in at the window and the farm quiet around them. "A boy," he said. "You don't get to decide that," she said. "I know, but I think a boy." She was right to be skeptical of his prediction, as it turned out. Their son was born in November of 1885, a solid and vocal boy who arrived with Hayes's coloring and Willa's expression, and who established from his first week a clear opinion about his own preferences. They named him James Thomas Yarrow, James for Hayes's father, Thomas for the man Willa had loved before, a decision Willa made without discussion, and Hayes accepted without qualification, understanding it for what it was, which was a woman who did not erase her history but carried it honestly. Clara was 8 years old and took her role as older sister with the gravity of a territorial governor. She also took it with considerably more warmth than she applied to most endeavors, and James Yarrow grew up knowing that his sister's protection was absolute and occasionally overwhelming. Ruth, who was 61 when James was born, held him in her arms by the fire on his first night home, and told him several things about the land he had been born on, and the people who had kept it, and the importance of understanding where you came from. Hayes watched her, and thought about Cimarron, and the cattle drives, and all the years of not having a place that meant anything, and understood in a way he had not fully understood before why he had ridden south in the winter of 1883. Finch had left the territory in late 1883, which Beckett had written to inform them of with what Hayes suspected was understated satisfaction. Prescott had taken a position in Albuquerque. Cade had disappeared into whatever territory had not yet heard of his previous activities, which was the traditional resolution for men of his type. The farm that Finch had burned near Magdalena had been rebuilt by its owners. The injustice of what men like Finch had done to smaller operations, the Doyle farm, the 2 others in the corridor, remained, as injustices in the territory tended to remain, inadequately addressed by the institutions that should have addressed them. Hayes was aware of this. He donated work and material to help the Doyle operation rebuild, and Willa matched the donation in grain and seed, and they did not talk about it as charity because the recipients would not have taken it as such. The summer of 1887 was easier than most. The rains came adequately, the oats came in well, and James Yarrow, who was 18 months old and had determined that walking was the appropriate mode of travel for a person of his ambitions, spent most of his days following his father around the farm with a focus that Hayes found simultaneously moving and logistically complicated. One evening in late August, Hayes came in from the field at dusk to find Willa sitting on the porch step, not in her chair, but on the step, which was where she sat when she was thinking rather than resting, watching the light change over the oat field. James was asleep inside. Clara was reading. Ruth had gone to visit a friend in Santa Rosa for the week. Hayes sat down beside her on the step, and she leaned against him in the way she had come to do in the evenings, a small and complete contact that still, 2.5 years into their marriage, meant more to him than he ever found the right words for. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The harvest," she said, "and the year, and 4 years ago when I threw that jar at you." He looked at her profile in the dusk light. "Any regrets about throwing the jar?" "No, it was warranted at the time." She paused. "About the rest of it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think about what would have happened if I hadn't let you come back, if my pride had won over my corn crop. Your pride was justified." "Most of my pride is justified," she said, with the self-knowledge that was one of the things he loved most about her. "But this particular battle was not worth winning." She turned to look at him. "I told you I would never forgive you. I was certain of it. I know." "I was wrong," she said simply. "I am occasionally wrong. I try not to be, but it happens." He laughed. She watched him laugh with the warm directness that was hers alone, and then she leaned up and kissed him on the jaw, which was something she did when she felt generous, and he turned to meet it properly. And they sat on the step in the August dusk with the farm warm and golden around them. "I want to tell you something," she said after a while. "Tell me." "I think we might be expecting another one." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same matter-of-fact expression as before, and beneath it was the same warmth she had learned to let him see. "When?" "Spring, I think." "A girl," he said. "You don't get to decide that either." "I know, but I think a girl." She pressed her lips together against a smile. "We'll see." She settled back against his shoulder. "I want to name her Me if it is me Ruth." He thought about this. "For Ruth. She's been here every day of this. She deserves to be remembered in it." He put his arm around her. The dusk had gone to early dark and the stars were coming up fast over the flat land. In the direction of the oat field, a nighthawk was calling. "Me Ruth Yarrow," he said. "Ashford Yarrow," she corrected mildly. "Ashford Yarrow," he agreed. She turned out to be right, and he turned out to be right. The spring of 1888 brought a girl, small and dark-haired, and with the particular expression of someone who has arrived with a great deal to say, and is only temporarily unable to say it. They named her Me Ruth Ashford Yarrow, and Ruth held her the same way she had held James, by the fire, and told her the same things about the land and the people and the importance of where you came from. And this time, Hayes and Willa sat together on the settee watching, his arm around her shoulder and her hand wrapped around his, and Clara sat cross-legged on the floor watching Ruth and the baby with the expression of someone deeply satisfied with the arrangements. James, 2.5, was uncertain about me for approximately 4 days, after which he decided she was acceptable and began introducing her to everyone as my Me, including the dog and the horses, with whom he maintained strong personal relationships. The farm in the harvest of 1888 was everything Hayes had ridden south in February of 1883 looking for without knowing he was looking for it. The fields came in. The cattle were healthy. The family at the dinner table was Willa and Hayes and Clara, who was 11 now and beginning to have opinions about everything, and James, who was 2.5 and had opinions about a narrower range of things but with comparable intensity, and me, who was new and still discovering what opinions were, and Ruth, who presided over all of it from her chair with the authority of someone who has earned their place entirely. After supper, after the children were in bed and Ruth had gone to her room, Hayes and Willa did the accounting together at the kitchen table, which had become their habit, the farm's numbers as a shared language, both of them fluent in what the columns meant. The harvest had been strong. The oat price had been good. The mortgage was paid down further than it had ever been. The Tilden parcel had produced better than the first 2 years had promised. Next year, Willa said, making a notation in the accounting book, I want to look at a second well on the east edge. The summer was dry enough that I worry about the cattle water. I can dig it in March before the planting season. I know you can. She made another notation. I want to hire Aldis's eldest for the summer. He's old enough now and his father says he's a good worker. He is. I've seen him in the field. She closed the accounting book and set it aside and looked at him across the table. The lamp between them put warm light on her face, and she was looking at him with the look that was only his, the one that did not have any armor in it. Hayes, she said. Willa. Are you happy? It came out simply, without ceremony, the way she asked things that mattered to her. He looked at the kitchen, the lamp, the closed accounting book with its honest columns, the house around them full of sleeping people he loved. I am the happiest I have ever been, he said. In every possible way. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already calculated. Then she reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his hand to hold hers, and they sat in the lamplit kitchen of the Ashford Yarrow farm in the good quiet of a harvest evening in 1888, with the land outside resting and the year measured and put away, and everything between them was resolved and warm and full. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the night wind, the ones Willa had planted the year she decided she was staying. They were tall now, strong and rooted, making the shade she had planted them to make. In the morning the harvest would be done and the fields would go to rest, and the work of winter and planning for spring would begin, and they would do all of it together, and it would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be everything. She had said she would never forgive him, and he had spent the entire harvest proving her wrong, and they had built something from the proving that was stronger than what would have stood if there had never been anything to forgive, because it was built from honesty, and from work, and from the kind of trust that knows it has been tested and has held. The lamp burned low. The farm was quiet. Hayes Yarrow sat at the kitchen table of the home he had earned with his hands and his honesty and his patience, his hand around his wife's hand, and he was home.